The first one comes to us from the prophet Isaiah. This is found in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, and I actually deliberately chose this passage because there is a particular verse in this passage that has been used by the Presbyterian Church USA as one of their scriptural calling cards when they're talking about gun violence. And I'll let you know when we get there. But we look at chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. A shoot shall come from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. A wolf shall live with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. And this is the verse. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Our second reading comes to us from the Gospel of Luke. This is a moment when Jesus weeps over the city of Jerusalem. This is found in chapter 19, beginning with verse 41. As he came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, if you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that made for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Indeed, the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up ramparts around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. They will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave within you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God. This is the word of the Lord. I'm going to confess that I had difficulty coming up with a sermon for today. I know folks tend to think that I can write gun violence sermons in my sleep because I talk about it so much. But every time I approach the process of having to talk about this issue, I ask myself, what more can we say? What more is to be said? How is it that we can possibly talk about this yet again? Because I can assure you, there is no issue I would rather not preach about ever again than gun violence. So I want to start this way because I know that I've shared with you pieces of my own personal story with gun violence. But today, I think I want to take you through that day and through those days to give you a sense of what it's like to live through this. So on Friday the 13th of all days, in 2015, in March, I was home. I was off work that day. I had taken a long weekend just for rest. And sometime in the afternoon, I don't remember what time, I got a frantic call from my mother saying, I need you to get dressed right now. We're leaving. And I said, well, what is going on? And she said, I cannot tell you at this moment. Just get dressed. I'm picking you up in 2 minutes. We're leaving. So, of course, I did as my mother says, because that's what good children do. And when I got into the car, we started driving out of the parking lot, and my mother said simply, well, no, actually, she said this before she ended the phone call. All she said was, Kevin's been shot. We have to leave right now. So Kevin was my brother-in-law. Kevin was my sister's husband. At the time, they had 3 young children. That was 8 years ago, right? So Olivia was, still a little thing. Wyatt was a little tiny thing, right? So we left. We spent 2 hours in the car on the way to Pittsburgh to meet them at the hospital. as we were driving to the hospital, my sister called and my mom said, what is going on? Because we're stuck in traffic and Pittsburgh was awful. And sis said, the shot was in the head. Kevin's not here anymore. He was alive. His body was functioning, but he was brain dead the minute he arrived at the hospital. So we arrived to find my sister and her group of moms at the hospital, sort of comforting each other. And there was Kevin, still breathing. By some miracle, we had no idea why he was still alive. And the doctor, at the moment we entered, was talking to my sister about whether or not to stop all life support. And I remember the surgeon saying to my sister, Kevin died the minute he was shot. Kevin will never live again. In fact, even as he lay there in that hospital bed, he was having a continuous stroke from the shot to his head. His body moving not by his own control. And so we sat vigil in this hospital room, in this emergency room in Pittsburgh. And I remember Kevin's mother had been away on vacation, and so she couldn't get back in time for sis to shut off the machines, right? So we made phone calls and had her talk to Kevin on the phone, and then we sat there for what seemed like forever. And then finally, I remember my sister turned on music. And the last song we heard was Big Old Jet Airliner. Kevin loved that song. And so as that song played, I remember my sister hugging Kevin and saying, the babies are going to be okay. I'm going to take care of them. But you have to go now. Kevin died a few minutes after that. In the coming days, sis actually asked Sean and I to lead the service for Kevin's funeral and asked me to give the eulogy at Kevin's funeral. It would ultimately become the first sermon I ever delivered on the evil that is gun violence, murder. But before we even got to the funeral, I think my most memorable, the thing that sticks out in my memory so vividly was sis coming home from the hospital. My dad had been there watching the kids. And she told all the kids to sit around in a little circle. And she sat on the floor with them and she said, I'm not going to hide the truth from you. A bad man killed your father, and he's not coming home. The confusion on their faces is something I will never forget. Watching my sister, my little sister, hold back her own suffering as she tried to comfort her children is something I will never forget. The fact that she had to have that conversation with these little babies is something that I will never forget. This experience is one of the reasons that the battle against violence is so deeply embedded in my own sort of theology. At the time, I was in a weird place. I had converted to Christianity several years before that. It was well known, and I had been toying with the idea of going to seminary, but wasn't sure. But I remember being at the funeral and thinking to myself, I had never seen that kind of grief before. When someone dies from old age or when they're in their 80s and 90s, right? It's different. Kevin, at the time, I don't even know if he was 40 yet. But it wasn't just that. It was the idea that none of this grief had to happen. It was preventable. The person who shot Kevin in the head was not a balanced human being, not somebody who should ever have had a concealed weapon on his person. A person Kevin had known for 20 years, who shot him in the head because he didn't want to pay $50 towards a tattoo that Kevin had given him. Kevin was a tattoo artist. $50 to take away a father, a husband, a brother, a son, a friend, a respected member of the community. Kevin's funeral was astronomically attended. It was incredible. My sister stood by his coffin for over 6 hours greeting people, one after the other. And then the final memory I have of that experience is watching my nephew, Griffin, walk up to his dad's coffin and fall on his knees. This doesn't go away. And as I was praying, God, what do I say about this? Please tell me what I'm supposed to preach about today. It was these images that suddenly started coming into my head. This is what God was showing me. This thing that had formed my life, that now forms hundreds of thousands of lives in this nation. Fast forwarding to a few days later, my sister and I are driving in the car, and I say to her, sis, I really feel like I'm called to go to seminary to enter the ministry, but I don't have time for that, and it's expensive, and I don't want to deal with this. Sis pulled the car over, middle of the highway. She just pulled over. Sis is a not so great driver, but anyway. And she looked at me and she said, if Kevin has taught us nothing, it's that we don't have time to piss around anymore. We don't have time to ask ourselves when the right time to act is. It's now. It will always be now. And so a month later, I entered seminary, and here we are. But as I entered seminary, I made a promise to myself. I promised myself that fighting against violence would be a centerpiece of my ministry in this world. Not just gun violence, all violence. Because violence is a sickness that needs to be healed. And so that is why when I look at things like gun violence, I see it as absolutely and completely antithetical to everything I know about Christian faith. When I look at the spiritual violence heaped upon LGBTQ people, I find it so antithetical to my basic understanding of Christian faith. Violence is incompatible with God. Period. Full stop. Violence is a sin that destroys neighbor, that corrupts community, that traumatizes innocent people. And so the other image that I could not get out of my head as I was trying to prepare for today was this image of Jesus weeping over Jerusalem. Because to me, there's always been something so powerful about this idea that Jesus weeps. Because it's not the only time Jesus will weep. Jesus will weep in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus will weep at the death of Lazarus. Jesus weeps. And Jesus' weeping in the text is not just weeping. In the Bible, when you see the word weeping, there are nuances to the word. And what the weeping actually means is that it speaks to this kind of uncontainable grief. It is a sadness that cannot be kept inside. An audible expression of lament. Now, we know Jesus did not weep often. But when Jesus did weep, it would help to pay attention. Because it usually marked moments of Jesus' own deep anxiety and deep sadness. And so to me, the weeping Jesus has always seemed like the most human Jesus. The Jesus that teaches us that it is not weakness to weep in the face of injustice and violence and death. It is actually proof that both the human and the divine heart break in the aftermath of humanity's attacks on itself. Jesus' heart broke, and our hearts break. But today, as I bring that image up in my brain, I think to myself, I believe Jesus is weeping now. I believe Jesus is weeping over these United States of America. I believe Jesus to be deeply, deeply hurt by what is happening to us. Jesus wept over Jerusalem because he said they were a people who refused to follow pathways to peace. They were a people who refused to know peace. They refused the message of Christ. They refused the chance of peace. They had decided that peace was impossible. If you, Jesus said, even you humans, even you people, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace. Jesus wept because Jerusalem had become a selfish place, an unjust place, a cruel and cynical place that no longer saw peace as a possibility, let alone a calling from God. This is the same city that Jesus in Luke and Matthew will call the city that kills prophets, the city that stones everyone God sends to speak to them. They are rejecting God's call over and over again, rejecting this call to peace, to Christ's message of peace. Christ gave us the instructions for peace, and they were ignored. And so it became a city of injustice and oppression, a city of corrupted political power, a city of fallen temples morally. And I wonder, did Jesus weep from grief over Jerusalem? Or did Jesus weep from an aching disappointment in a people who refused to embrace peace because they would not sacrifice their power? So maybe it was disappointment, or maybe it was frustration, and God knows we feel that. Frustration over a people given every opportunity to hear and accept a call to loving community by God, but who in their blindness chose self-interest over sacrifice. Or perhaps they were a people so paralyzed that they decided peace was an impossible dream. And so they looked away and accepted brokenness as inevitable, as their destiny. Yes, I believe Jesus weeps today. I believe that Jesus weeps over this nation that is held hostage every day. I believe that Jesus is weeping over a nation that watches 40,000 people a year or more die and does nothing. I believe that Jesus weeps over a nation that is actively sacrificing its children to idols. I believe Jesus weeps. I believe Jesus weeps over this pervasive idolatry of weapons that has become a religion, that has become as American as apple pie in the United States. You know, we had a gun violence vigil on Friday. Since that vigil, 220 additional people are dead. Since that vigil, one more child under the age of 11 has died. Since that vigil, 5 teenagers below the age of 19 have died. So far in this year, 18,073 people have died. This is June. We're halfway. Since Kevin's death in 2015, gun violence deaths have gone up an average of 10,000 people per year. $115 kids, ages birth to 11, are no longer with us this year. 653 teenagers from 12 to 17 are no longer with us today. Tens of thousands of more have been injured. And in all of our talk about safety, and all of our talk about the need to feel secure, I find it interesting that in all of these statistics, of those 18,073 shootings, only 481 are classified as self-defense. That's shocking. The number of police-involved shootings is not much higher. This is us shooting each other. And in a number that I think is quite fitting for this particular conversation, of all those shootings, 666 have been classified as unintentional. That means a child finds an unlocked gun in the house. That means a gun is stored improperly. That means a gun is stored loaded. That means somebody shoots themselves cleaning that gun. I challenge you to come up with another epidemic in this country that kills 40,000 people a year that we are actively doing nothing about. One issue, name one. And this is why we feel so desperate. And so as I was preparing for today, I thought it can't just be all this dark stuff, right? There has to be something to come out of this. In my case, my experience turned me into an activist, and I am not ashamed to say that. My experience made it very clear to me that as the church, as people of Christ, as the people of God, we don't have a choice to make about whether or not we are going to allow this violence to happen. This violence is evil. This violence is darkness. This violence is sin. It is anathema to everything we believe as Christian people. But the other thing I want to focus on a little bit is this idea that we know exactly what we're supposed to do. As the church, as people of faith, we are supposed to be proponents of peace. We are supposed to talk about the preservation of life, human life. We're supposed to talk about the sanctity of you as people living in this world. We're supposed to care about the children. Why? Because Jesus cared about children. Show me somebody Jesus spent more time hanging out with than children, and it will be sinners. Jesus cared about children. Jesus actually thought children were usually smarter than adults, and that happens to be true. Because the only signs of hope we have seen have come from children. Young people leaving their classrooms and their schools to protest. Not just a regular protest, though. They want to live. This is their lives they're fighting for. And so they became a force of moral courage and political courage in this nation. And they have done great and good work, and they should be commended, and God knows we should be listening to them. And that's where gun violence, to me, intersects with this idea of faith. This is not a political issue. Politics may have made this issue harder to deal with. Politics may have made this issue harder to understand. Politics may have lied to us to tell us that there are no solutions to this issue. Politicians may lie to us and tell us that there is nothing that they can do. But I don't care about the politics of gun violence. I don't care who gets mad about talking about it. I don't care about any of that. What I care about is the fact that this is a moral problem, a national health crisis. And I happen to know that morality and health happen to fall very squarely into the bailiwick of the Christian church, because Jesus did a lot of giving out health care. And Jesus did a lot of talking about the morality of peace, the morality of nonviolence. And our response to Jesus, the Jesus who wept over the Jerusalem that refused peace, our response to the Jesus who brought the message of peace was to subject him to violence. Jesus Christ is a victim of violence, of our violence, and forgave us anyway. I feel like we have entered into a period where we all feel kind of a little paralyzed. This happens every day. I mean, 200 and some people in just 2 days, right? We hear about it all the time. In fact, if you watch the news as much as I do, and I don't recommend it, you will find that the only shootings that get on the news have more than 5 victims. The other ones aren't sensational enough. There are hundreds of shootings every day that we don't even know about. So what do we do? It is so easy to feel lost in this. It is so easy to feel overwhelmed by this. And frankly, as we watch this sort of rising tide of permitless carry laws and easy access to weapons, as we watch a marketing campaign for AR-15s for teenagers. God knows this feels really hard and impossible. I know it feels impossible because I feel it too. And so as I was preparing, my question was, well, what do we do about this, right? What can we do? Well, I'm a Presbyterian. I don't know if you knew that. I get accused of, being Catholic sometimes, but I'm a Presbyterian. And the Presbyterian Church decided in its inception that the best expression of governance in the church was democracy. We decided democracy was the best way for us to fulfill God's call. I'm going to make a point, don't worry. Democracy depends on the voices of its people. Democracy depends on the voices of those people being heard by its leaders. Democracy depends on the ability of a majority voice to make decisions. Not always good, not always great, but this is what we have decided to do because we believe that democracy is essential in the church, that all voices deserve to be heard. We are living in a nation right now populated by political leadership that doesn't care what you think about anything. Because if you look at polling, right, and I know people can get all wonky about polling and that's fine, but if you look at polling data about things like background checks and assault weapons bans and universal background checks, closing gun show loopholes, trying to end school violence, these things are approved by up to 90% of the American people, and that includes both parties, by the way. So I want to ask you, how is your democracy faring? As you cry out against this violence, as we beg for solutions and nothing happens, how well are we really doing when the voices of people don't make decisions? The voices of dollar bills do. There is more lobbying done to prevent gun violence prevention than almost anything else in Washington. It is one of the most well-funded, well-fueled operations in this country. Gun organizations have suggested that we would better understand them if we considered them one of the world's major religions. They think of themselves as a religion. Well, I don't know about you, Christian folks, but I don't like that. In fact, I consider it one of the most disgusting heresies of the 21st century. It's blasphemy, plain and simple. And so here we are the church, right? So what are we supposed to do about this? What can we, the church, do about this? Well, first of all, we can do this. We can take some of our precious time every year to talk about this issue in a deliberate and intentional way. That's important. I know it seems sometimes like we're just shouting at the rain, but it matters. It matters that people get together and pray for those affected. Yes, I said pray. I know thoughts and prayers are a thing. It's also important that churches everywhere begin having this conversation. So if you're not a member of this church, you should ask your own religious leaders, why aren't you talking about this if they're not talking about this? Because I don't know of a more pervasive social issue that needs our attention, a more pervasive health issue, a more pervasive spiritual issue, because let me also suggest that gun violence, the trauma that's caused by gun violence, the PTSD, the aftermath of gun violence, is also one of the largest sources of spiritual desolation in the United States. It is horrifying. And I can tell you from personal experience, nothing will drive you to doubt your own faith quicker than facing down this particular evil. So this matters. It matters that we gather together and do this. It matters that we held a vigil for 12 hours filibustering violence for as long as we possibly could. It matters. It matters that voices are willing to stand up and say, you know what, I cannot live like this anymore. It matters that children are taking to the streets to say enough is enough. The church should be listening to those children. But it's deeper than that. Because there is also an unholy alliance between this sort of extremist, give guns to everyone ideal, and a rising tide of Christian nationalism in this nation. You cannot separate the two. Armed Christian nationalism. And for the record, there's no such thing as Christian nationalism. It's just nationalism. Another great heresy of the 21st century. To even give it the moniker of Christianity is disturbing. And so we are seeing this rising tide of violence on all fronts. People randomly attacking innocent kids in their schools. People shooting up churches. People shooting up concerts. People shooting up grocery stores. People shot in their homes, shot in their streets. I would challenge you to tell me where we are safe. And safety matters to us. God wants humanity to be safe. God wants us to care about the safety of others. That is the premise of loving your neighbor. This is a real moral inflection point for the church. We can ignore the issue, absolutely. We never have to talk about this again. And then we will be complicit. Complicit in an ongoing terrorist attack on our own nation. So I wanted to give you some things. There is something we are actually going to do. First, I want you to understand that our national denomination has made very public statements about how they feel about gun violence. They have called on churches everywhere, Presbyterian churches everywhere, to begin supporting ideas like assault weapons bans, to begin demanding more common sense gun legislation. It's sense. To recommend that we don't allow people to buy guns in bulk for no apparent reason. That we make sure that those in our communities who are responsible gun owners, and yes, they exist, folks. Just for the record, I still own a 20-gauge shotgun. It's just not in New York. I was quite an accomplished little skeet shooter in my day. I used to go target shooting with my dad all the time. I've been around guns since I was born. But I was around people who taught me to fear them, to treat them respectfully, to understand that they are potentially dangerous and deadly weapons. So we need people like that in our communities talking about what it means to be a safe and responsible gun owner. because it is possible. I would also tell you that the gun owners I grew up around did not have AR-15s in their gun cabinets. Why? Because they didn't believe that weapons of war belonged on the street. The same gun organizations that are lobbying against safety are the ones that used to promote it. We are through the looking glass here. And so the church has a responsibility to lift up the voices that can teach us, that can lead us in understanding that the only reason we refuse to talk about this whole problem isn't really about politics. It's about money. You can tell. Anytime you see a politician on TV who doesn't want to talk about this, I'm going to tell you what they're going to say. Well, we have a big mental health problem in the United States. They're not wrong. We also have a big mental health institutional crisis in the United States. Our mental health systems are not working. But those same voices who will tell you that that is our problem will also pass legislation to strip funding away from mental health services. This is moral hypocrisy at its finest. Not to mention the religious hypocrisy of offering your thoughts and prayers to all those affected by gun violence in their communities, but your refusal to do a single thing to stop it. That's a special kind of hypocrisy. And so we as the church have to hold that hypocrisy accountable. It's hypocrisy to pray and do nothing. And so our denomination has called on us to support basic common sense gun legislation. Our denomination has also decided to begin the process of exploring what it means to divest our investments away from any company that manufactures the parts of an assault weapon, any company that has any skin in causing this particular crisis. But here's what we are going to do, because if you'll find out in the entryway a little handout given to us by the PCUSA called 10 Things You Can Do to Prevent Gun Violence. And so I'm going to end with this. And this, number one, is what we are going to do. Between now and the next time we do communion, which will be in July, I encourage you, or I welcome you, to write letters to our political representatives. Those letters will be collected when you come up for communion in July. I will copy them, and I will send them to every political figure that affects this community. I will remind you every week. You can say whatever you want. I will not censor you. You can write whatever you want. I probably will not even look at them. But the only way to reclaim our power is to begin using our voices in constructive and creative ways. So we can do things like identifying the organizations in our communities that engage in gun violence prevention, and we can get involved with them. If there aren't any, I'm already looking at starting one. We can attend demonstrations, peaceful prayer services to address gun violence. We can contact our political representatives in our communities, our mayors and our council members, and ask them what steps we are taking to prevent this scourge in our own communities. And here in Cayuga County, we can ask them what they are doing to make access to mental health care for suicidal people easier. Because Cayuga County has a suicide crisis. And a gun in the house makes it 90% more likely that a suicide attempt will be successful. In fact, the gun you own in your house for your own protection is 11 times more likely to be used against you than a criminal. We can ask that loopholes be closed so that background checks are essential in every gun purchase. We can ask the leaders of our worshiping communities to address gun violence in our worship services with periodic preaching and liturgy and prayer and education and resources to help us feel more empowered and more involved. We can learn about our state's laws, learn about the holes in our own state's laws, and advocate to close them. We can encourage our places of work and worship to prominently display signs that prohibit carrying guns onto their property. We can encourage those we know who are responsible gun owners to become examples and leaders for others. And we have those here. We can access denominational resources. The PCUSA has been working on gun violence since 1968. You should read the 1968 overture. It sounds a lot like the 2021 overture. And if we can't find resources, we'll create them. We will pray, yes, we will pray about this issue. We will preach about this issue. We will learn about this issue. And this church will be a place where we can discuss this issue without judgment, without fighting, without political idiocy. We will discuss this as the crisis that it is, a moral health and physical health crisis, a spiritual health crisis. I don't know about you all, but I've had enough of the politics of gun violence. This is no-brainer stuff. People are dying who should not be dying. Full stop. That is where this discussion begins and ends, whether it is politically or spiritually. So write your notes, write your letters, say what you need to say to feel better, and let us be a voice. Not one more is one of the monikers of the movement, right? Not one more, one more little kid, not one more mom, not one more dad, not one more brother, not one more neighbor, not one more friend, not one more supermarket, not one more church, not one more school. I believe we can change this. I believe that at the core of my being. But it begins by understanding that Jesus wept over the city that refused to listen. Jesus wept over the city that refused to accept a call to peace and love. God, don't let us be that nation. Amen.